Hello and welcome to episode number 68 of Gar Borras' Time Machine. Gar, as always, I have so much fun doing this with you. Today is no exception. We're going to be talking about Dr. No, which is the very first James Bond movie ever. And what I was reading about this is that really James Bond, the James Bond movies really kind of introduced the world, kind of led to future, the kind of spy movie craze, if you will.
Yeah, the thing was it was perfect timing for something like that to happen, simply because, in the early 60s when this movie came out, it was basically during that, I remember when we were doing The Nutty Professor, which is very similar time period.
Yeah.
When both movies were released, and the premise of The Nutty Professor was him taking that whatever concoction that he came up with as a professor that would turn him into the cool guy. The guy that everybody, all the other men want to be, and all the other women want to be with. And that is basically what Sean Connery is. He's a spy version of Buddy Love.
Yeah, so true. Now, just to give people an idea of what we're talking about, Dr. No is a 1962 spy film, the first movie in the James Bond franchise of films, which has included, get this, Gar, a total of 27 films to date. Dr. No is a film that started it all, of course, starred the original James Bond himself, Sean Connery, and Sean Connery starred in the first 7 James Bond films, Gar. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Well, for me, I've watched so many James Bond movies, and I've seen many different versions of James Bond. But, when you're my age and you grew up with it, seeing Sean Connery as the original, it reminds me of the same thing that I run into with Guns N' Roses fans.
Yeah.
The really hardcore Guns N' Roses fans really focus on the original lineup.
Sure.
Those 5 guys when the band first broke. And that is the coveted lineup of that band. But then it's the same thing here with Sean Connery. You know what I mean? It's really a very similar phenomenon where you really latch on to Sean Connery as as the original one. And for me, the others really can't compare. There are, to me, every time I give another James Bond a chance, they kind of fall short. And some of the reason why they're falling short with me is a personal thing, because of the personal attachment.
Sure.
So in a way, I'm not being fair in my comparisons of Sean Connery to the other ones. I'm leaning much more to my personal attachment as to that is what I grew up with.
Makes sense.
You know what I mean?
Now, Gar, and specifically talking about this movie we're talking about today, Dr. No, do you remember seeing it for the first time? I mean, did you see it in the movie theater when it first came out? Did you see it on TV? What was your experience?
Well, I was a kid, so my parents weren't going to take me to the theater to see a movie like that because, there's another thing that, gets lost in the shuffle. And what I mean by that is we're talking about the early 60s.
Yeah.
So, it was a lot different, back in those days.
Sure.
and so there's a lot of things that were happening that are really kind of shows a snapshot of that time period, really showcasing pop culture, that the pop culture that existed back then.
Yeah, and really, it really did. I'll give you a great point. When I was watching the movie last night, prepping for today's episode, I'm watching on my DVD, of course, in my living room of my house, and I'm noticing, like any movie when you watch it, one thing that really stood out to me is just look at the cars that were in the movie. I'm like thinking, okay, yeah, those look like cars you would have seen in the 1960s, and so that's one of the things that really stood out, and then even little things like at the beginning of the movie, he's at the airport, he goes into the phone booth. You don't see too many movies with payphones anymore these days, but those are just a couple of things that kind of really stood out from the time,
Well, okay, I have to say this because I distinctly remember an instance, the very first instance where I became aware of James Bond.
Okay.
And the whole thing, and it wasn't in the theaters, it was at home, it was on TV.
Yeah.
And I don't think that my parents were around, at the time. And what I distinctly remember is, that James Bond movies had an element of very risque for that time period.
Sure.
Very sexual overtones or undertones.
Yeah.
That were part of it. And as a young child, kind of, discovering this whole male and women seducing men, because basically the women characters in James Bond movies, see, that's another thing about that snapshot of pop culture.
Yeah.
At that time, all the women characters were seductresses. Women at that time, we've talked about this.
Yeah.
Women. Even in the 70s, a whole decade after this, women could not buy a house. Women could not get a credit card. Women were a subjugated element of society at that time.
Yeah.
And it shows in movies because they don't show women in James Bond movies other than seductresses.
Yeah. And, even on television, you don't get Linda Carter playing Wonder Woman until the late 1970s. And even then, they were showing a lot of skin just so male viewers would tune in,
Yeah, it was... see, that it's really interesting to see shifts when you look at the 60s and these movies, because, some of the purposes of movies is to actually integrate things from that time period into the storyline so the public... it becomes gravitated to the movies. They can relate because it's part of things that they see in their everyday lives. But now, when you take it many, many, many years later, and you look, it really is a time capsule that really kind of showcases a whole bunch of things about the 60s. Now, number one, part of the appeal of the James Bond character is that he has this, he runs with the rich crowds. He has sophistication. he has all of these, upper crust qualities, and that's part of the reason why people like to watch movies, is because it's kind of the ability for us to kind of fantasize that we are part of that upper crust society and we're interjecting and we get to, but we're actually just kind of like keeping Toms in James Bond's life. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But you see what? It's all a formula to draw the public in and make people relate to the characters, and having all of the things that's from that time period that are all the trappings we get to look at now, and it looks so dated and it's so old technology and it's so different now. It's really interesting to look back, because it really showcases the changes.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points, Gar, and one of them is like, after I got done watching the film last night, I went online and I was reading stuff about the film, and it said that beach scene in the film where the girl first appears in that white bikini is become one of the most iconic shots ever in the history of filmmaking. And interestingly enough, I thought, okay, I'm going to go see if I can find any beach, those any photos of that beach scene, being the fact that it's such an iconic shot in film history. And I came up with some photos of when they were on the beach, but not that one for some particular reason. I'm wondering, maybe, okay.
And I remember the picture too.
Yeah.
It was an iconic picture, but it just really just another one of those indications of how time fades things. And because Ursula Andress,
yeah, that's her name.
Basically, what she was the predecessor before Raquel Welch.
Yeah, and actually,
really, that is what she was in movies. She was basically what Raquel Welch became in movies. She was that before Raquel Welch anybody even knew who she was. She was not even part of the whole scene. At that time.
Yeah. I mean, she set the standard.
And a lot of because she's the predecessor, people only really remember Raquel Welch, and now Ursula Andress has become a faded and just becomes more faded and more lost and more obscure. And it's really sad because at the time in the 60s, she was considered one of the most beautiful women in the world.
I mean, that was quite obvious in watching the film last night. I mean, like you're saying, she set the standard not just for what a Bond girl is, but she set the standard for Hollywood sex symbol as far as when talking about women. I mean, when she first comes on, and you see her in that white bikini. I mean, for most of the film, we've been paying attention to James Bond, and then all of a sudden she just appears in the film in that white bikini, and you're like, oh my God, what a beautiful princess! Who is that? And even when he first comes up to her, she's not too sure about him, and she pulls out her little knife from her little bikini and lets him kind of know, hey, I can take care of myself. And from that point on in the film, those are the two people that you're really paying attention to throughout the entire film.
Well, also keep in mind that she was the female seductress that was introduced in movies, that introduced the bikini to the public and spawned women to wear the bikini. All of that is lost. All of that is faded. That iconic scene introduced the bikini to the public and spawned the public to start wearing bikinis at the beach.
Yeah. Wow.
It didn't exist before that.
Yeah, and Gar Borras, like I was saying, Sean Connery starred in 7 of these James Bond films, just in case anybody's interested. Of course, the very first one we've been talking about, Dr. No. From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, Diamonds Are Forever, and Never Say Never Again. And then, at some point, they decided to replace him, because I guess at some point, even I guess when they started filming Dr. No, I was reading that he was starting to lose his hair. And there were rumors at the time that he was wearing a toupee, but he didn't start wearing a toupee until like the third Bond film.
Well, he was actually not the first choice either. There were, Sean Connery wasn't even the first choice, to play that character. And Ian Flemming, the originator of the whole thing, really did not visualize in his mind, this is the guy that created it. He did not visualize James Bond being Sean Connery. He visualized a much more, I guess what you would call more of a Roger Moore, thing to the character but man, I just think that, without Sean Connery, I don't think you have the movie having the success, or the whole franchise having the success that it winds up having. And the James Bond movies also spawned a completely different phenomenon, the Bond girl.
Yeah.
That is a phenomenon on its own. And what are each and every Bond girl for every James Bond movie? They're all seductresses.
Yeah, that is true. Now, Gar, I got to ask you this, because as far as who was the one that was originally considered for the part, believe it or not, was Cary Grant. And the reason they did not go with Cary Grant was because he would only commit to doing one Bond film, and they wanted somebody that would commit to doing more than one film. And so then the search kind of began, which eventually led them to Sean Connery.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine Cary Grant. He does embody that same kind of thing that I was talking about.
Sophistication.
That Roger Moore, sophisticated, that whole thing. But Sean Connery really does bring that to the character, and I don't think that he was really being given credit. He just had this, this rugged, what they call rugged good looks.
Yeah, and
you know what I mean?
And like a lot of movies, this movie and the other James Bond movies were based on a book series written by Ian Flemming, as you said. Now, I think it was much more popular over in Europe and England, but it like just exploded once they started the movie franchise, because it's one thing to kind of read something like this in a book, but to bring it to the big screen and you see all the action, the sex, and the explosions, it's quite another thing to kind of bring it to life. And I think that's why this works so well, in all these movies.
Well, it's just another one of those, the movie was made at the right time. The storylines were perfect. The main character was a guy that all men wanted to be and all women wanted to be with. It just really goes back to what I always say. It's one of the hardest things to do in the entertainment industry, and it exists in all different factions of the industry, but it's capturing lightning in a bottle.
And even
Michael Jackson captured lightning in a bottle. The Beatles captured lightning in a bottle. James Bond movies captured, the Dr. No started the whole thing off by capturing lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, and Gar, James Bond is a great example of what you're talking about, because James Bond is an interesting phenomenon in the sense that, like you said, sequels aren't typically too popular. Now, this is one of the probably the longest probably ever film franchise, having 27 films in it, and continues to be successful. Now, people continue to, a lot of people that even weren't there will tell you, they go back, they check out the older films, and a lot of people tell you, their favorite James Bond, of course, is Sean Connery, like you say, for some reason. He's the classic, he's the original, so that's the one everybody kind of navigates toward. But, Connery's no longer here. They want to continue making movies, and so they get younger guys to, do it. And it's become a thing where the character, it's almost like the character is more popular, more important than the actor playing it, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And it's kind of like Batman.
Yeah, yeah.
Who's going to play Batman? Same kind of thing. But, I don't even know the guy, his name that's currently playing James Bond.
Yeah,
I think, he's really good.
Yeah.
I think he's the best of the bunch.
I think Daniel Craig.
Daniel Craig, yeah. He for a long time, because I've always been so disappointed with other people playing the James Bond character. I would give it a chance, and I'd be kind of disappointed. But Daniel Craig, because Chris Cornell did the James Bond song for Casino Royale.
Yeah.
It kind of sparked me to give that a chance.
Yeah,
and so I have to be honest. I'm probably going to give the Daniel Craig versions a bit more of a chance than I've been. I kind of was writing it off before I would even give it a chance.
Yeah, and not to get too much into this, Gar, but like the latest film that they put out a couple years back, it was popular, but at the same time, it received a lot of backlash because, like a lot of film companies, they went kind of woke, and they want to try to do something brilliant and kind of change everybody's image of James Bond, where, Daniel Craig decided he doesn't want to do any more James Bond, so I don't know who the next one is going to be, but what they were going to do is supposedly kill off the James Bond character, and then they have this black lesbian and spy also in that works for the same spy agency, and she's going to become take over the name of James Bond, become the new. And everybody kind of had a backlash to that, because when we think of James Bond, we think of like a British spy. And yeah, this was a British black person who's a lesbian. And not that should matter, but I'm like, if you're going to replace a person, replace it with somebody that at least looks like the character we've come to know and love. Don't try to go totally crazy and change what James Bond is, if you know what I mean. And they received so much backlash that they said, okay, we're not going to do that.
Oh, okay, I was going to ask you, did they do that?
No, and there hasn't been another film since, but
okay.
they received.
It sounds like basically we're talking about something that somebody was kicking around.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, if you were to check out the very last film they put out, you kind of leave thinking, James Bond has supposedly been killed, and this person's going to take over the James Bond name and or be referred to as 007. In future films, and I'm like, okay, I don't see having a woman as James Bond. I mean, you could even have somebody take over, but you know what I mean? That's not people's vision of James Bond, and I hate when they try to reimagine or recreate a classic character. I mean, why not create a new character? You know what I mean?
Well, we're getting old, and new people are becoming interested in it, and their tastes are completely different than ours.
Yeah, I guess.
And so when people kick around ideas like that, it obviously, it didn't. The cream didn't rise to the top.
Yeah, thank God.
You know what I mean? But you're never going to stop people from kicking around ideas.
Yeah.
But giving crap to somebody for just kicking around ideas, that doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say, though, Gar, it shows kind of the power of social media. back in the day, maybe a film company would have just done what they wanted to do or what they were planning to do, but they received so much, hate mail against that idea that we're not going to do that after all. And they even
to be honest with you, when I watched the James Bond movies, nowadays, because when the movies were released back in the 60s, it was a male-dominated society. Women did not have freedoms. Women were a subjugated part of society at that time, and obviously things had changed because when people are subjugated, they get tired of it.
Yeah.
And they start lashing back.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's going on. And, when you look back now, because it really, there is misogynistic elements to James Bond movies that were made back in the 60s, and I recognize that.
Oh, sure.
That is the truth, because that is the lens of that movie is through the eyes of people during that time period.
Yeah.
And so nowadays, those type of storylines and stuff like that, because women are sick and tired of being subjugated, well, they're not going to have it. And they're going to let their opinion be known that they're sick and tired of this misogynistic stuff.
Yeah.
It's not easy for men to understand that, because men are not experiencing these things. It's the women that are experiencing. It's the men that are actually delivering it.
Yeah.
And so you would not be able to make a movie with such misogynistic angles to the thinking behind the movie.
Yeah.
It's just not going to be accepted, because people pretty much have had it up to here. And you can visualize what I'm doing. I got my hand above my head.
Yeah.
They pretty much had it with how they were being treated, and how society was allowing them to be able to function. And so, you can't have people that are being subjugated without having them, say, hey, you know what? That's enough.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's going on.
Yeah. It said that Dr. No is set in London, Jamaica, and Crab Key, a fictional island off of Jamaica. So what I was reading was, while it's supposed to be based in London, a lot of the film was actually filmed in Jamaica, which is, quite different.
Well, it was, that's another thing about the movie is it was showcasing luxury places in luxurious spots, and really, to nowadays, we look at it and it's like, what's the big deal? But back in the 60s, people weren't seeing these exotic locations.
Yeah.
Like they've seen a million times nowadays. And so back in the 60s, it was really kind of take your breath away, some of this stuff, that they were, showing in the movies. It was considered very exotic for that time.
Yeah, and I was reading that, to your point, that that's become a thing throughout the history of all the James Bond movies, is that when they go to write a movie or create it, they specifically pick out exotic locations, like you said, because that's something that the franchise has become known for.
Well, and each time as the movies came out, they tried to take your breath away more and more and more. This first Dr. No is just the start.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Like you said, it's just the start, and yet the James Bond movies were also a blueprint for future action-packed movies. All the James Bond movies, one thing they've got in common too is they're action-packed. I mean, you got the crazy car chases and car scenes and motorcycle flips. I mean, in this one alone, if you remember at the very top of the film, where that car kind of just goes down the hill and just kind of, there's that huge explosion, and then.
Now I don't know who is first, but I don't know. I think it's really worth looking into because I think it can be found out. But I think either Steve McQueen or Sean Connery, one of those two guys, were the first ever action heroes.
Oh, yeah. Well, probably Steve McQueen, I would
don't think action heroes existed before these two guys started doing those type of characters.
No, because if you think about it, like even in the 1930s and 40s, they had a lot of... they had monster and horror movies. They had westerns and cowboy type movies. They had war movies. People going off to war and stuff, and holiday themed movies. So that was what was kind of popular. And I got to thinking about that. And you're probably right. Steve McQueen probably was a little before James Bond, so it might have been him.
It very well might have, but man, they're so close. You know what I mean? And they both became so iconic because of their action hero movies.
Yeah, and another...
for Steve McQueen, it was Bullet.
That
car chase in San Francisco, that had never been done in a movie before. See, people don't understand that, but that's the reason why for the Time Machine. In the movie Bullet, that was the riveting first car chase scene ever in a movie.
Oh, Gar,
he did it in a Mustang.
Wow, Gar, I think that's a future episode right there. You just gave me that idea.
We really need to do one on Steve McQueen.
Yeah.
Because just like Ursula Andress is becoming faded, and she was Raquel Welch before anybody ever knew anything about her. Well, but the same thing with Steve McQueen.
Yeah.
He's becoming faded too, and people are but honestly, I think he is the first ever action hero that ever existed in a movie.
Yeah, another great actor in that same category that died tragically young would be James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, and he's one of those guys that for people that were around at that time, or people that are just fan of his work, very, very popular actor. I mean, it's so sad he died the way he did, as young as he was. Think of what that guy's career could have been, but yet he had that kind of popularity in his little short life, and yet, like you're saying, as popular as even James Dean was, he's one of those cats that is starting to fade. Even like
yeah, people are starting to forget about him too. And dude, I mean, forever in my life, James Dean has been an icon. I mean, that's the thing. Time, nobody escapes Father Time.
Yeah, James Dean.
There's just no way. Whatever is going on now, eventually will become something that people will pretty much forget about and have been forgotten about in the future. And because things change so much faster now, because technology has created this, where changes that used to take decades to happen now happen in a year or in less than a year. So what I mean by that is that is a new phenomenon now, which can affect how people forget things. People very well might forget things much sooner. Than for my generation.
I mean, Gar, people...
You know what I mean? So it's really hard to tell, because that this whole effect that technology is having on society right now is something that never existed before.
Well, I gotta tell you, Gar, talking a little bit about technology. The older we get, a lot of these classic films they age, and that's why a lot of times they'll have to re-release. They'll go back, and I tell you, Doctor No was one of the first ones they went back and kind of restored. And I'm watching on a DVD last night, and even though this is a film from 1962, the beautiful restoration they did, it was amazing. It was like, and I was watching a thing they had on one of the bonus things on the DVD, and they're talking about restoring this classic film. And like you look at the blue sky, it's like a blue you've never seen before. I mean, it's an old 1962 film, and yet the colors and everything are just so alive. Even just watching it on a DVD, it was quite the experience.
Well, color was brand new, and at that time it was Technicolor.
Yeah.
So what they did is they made the colors even more vivid than they actually are. Yeah. And you do that with exposure with the camera. You can have those effects. By the type of cameras and the exposure. And this is something that's brand new that I'm learning right now, because I just bought a bunch of cameras, and I'm going to start videotaping my band's shows with multi-cameras. So I can pretty much set it up at every show.
That's cool.
And be able to capture the performance with multi cameras and things like that. So all of this is brand new to me, because I've never really gotten into this.
Yeah.
And right now I'm at the very beginning of learning all of this stuff about exposure and all of these things. And those are things that they can control with the camera. So they really at that time, they really wanted to make the fact that it was color really jump out at you.
Yeah,
you see what I mean?
Oh, yeah. And Gar, just what I'm getting ready to say next, this is kind of going to point out to what we were talking about earlier about just how popular of a James Bond character is. It said in 2005, the American Film Institute placed the James Bond character as the third greatest film hero of all time. I mean, number 3 in the history of filmmaking. That's pretty huge.
Yes. And how the best way to describe it, icon.
Yeah.
Icon.
Yeah, and
you know what I mean?
Another thing that, like we talked a little bit about this throughout today's episode, but this was also the first film that really people would go and watch a film and were inspired by the fashion. Like they would go out and buy the type of clothes that James Bond was wearing. They wanted... Well,
because he was so sophisticated.
Yeah.
Men wanted to be him, and how do you want to be him? You dress like him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and also talking about the character of James Bond, it was very much like the character of Fonzie in the sense that he was just so cool. His coolness was never questioned. People just kind of... That was their idea back in the 1960s of cool. You never doubted for a minute that he could. I mean, like last night I'm watching Dr. No, and he's killed all these people throughout the film. He just does it like it's another day at the office. Doesn't even flinch, and you just don't question his ability to do that. Like you might watch some films. That guy, he never really do that, but you don't question it because it's James Bond.
Well, another thing that's kind of funny is when they use silencers on the guns.
Oh, I noticed that.
Movies.
Yeah, you can hear it. Yeah.
Silencers in movies are completely different silencers than in real life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The way they're portraying how well it silences the shot of the gun. Mm-hmm. It has no bearing on the reality of a silencer with a gun.
Yeah.
Two completely different things. But that's, there's a number of things that used to go on in movies like that that's just not real. It's like quicksand.
Yeah, I remember.
Back in the 60s. Quicksand. When I was a kid, I thought quicksand was everywhere.
Yeah, that takes me back to watching the classic Batman. Every time they be in quicksand. Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah,
it's just like, it's just not based in reality.
And it's funny what a kid will believe.
So it's just fun. And another thing that I noticed, when, in watching is in movies from the 60s, the way they recorded sound in these movies was the most sophisticated technology they had. But when you go back and you watch these movies now, you notice how different movies used to sound back in those days.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And, I'm really glad you brought up the thing about the silencer, because when I'm watching the film last night, I'm like, for being a silencer, that's probably one of the loudest things in the film.
Yeah, but I mean, according to the movie, you could shoot somebody with a gun with a silencer and not wake somebody up.
Yeah, and Gar. Gar, you want to talk about iconic? This is the very first time people heard the catchphrase Bond, James Bond, and of course it was at the very beginning of the film. And another iconic thing you probably caught notice of is how all the James Bond movies start with that little kind of swirl thing that he goes in, and then you see
it's actually a camera lens.
Yeah.
That it can go down to a small hole to control the exposure, what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And people might see that and think, okay, that looks pretty neat. But that itself has become iconic to the point that, I mean, kind of like could you imagine ever having a James Bond movie where that was not featured at the beginning, or they just, we're not going to do that. We're going to create something new and improved. People would have such a backlash to that. Oh my God! Kind of like when Alex Trebek shaved his mustache.
Well, people are always going to kick things around.
Yeah.
But that is always part of the creative process. You can't have a creative process without people kicking things around.
Yeah.
But the cream will always rise to the top.
Yeah, and it usually does. It said Dr. No introduced the world to James Bond's love of martinis. That's another thing that kind of, if you see a lot of the films, you kind of pick up on along the way his love for drinking as well.
Well, martinis.
Yeah.
And in preparing for this episode has sparked my interest in trying martinis and experiencing the different types to see if there is something that I might prefer. Yeah. Because my entire life, I have never, ever had an interest in trying a martini. But for some reason now, because of doing this episode on Dr. No, I have to admit, drinking alcohol is not a big part of my life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I'm with you. Yeah.
Alcohol is not a dominant part. It's a very, very, it's just something, that I like to enjoy, like the finer things in life. I don't like to drink a whole case of Budweiser at the end of the day.
And get out of control.
I would prefer to experiment maybe with just having a this or a that, instead of drinking for getting drunk, enjoying it for the flavor and the different things like that. And that is how I enjoy alcohol, and that's how James Bond enjoys alcohol. But it really has sparked my interest in wanting to see what that's all about.
Yeah, that's...
I don't know what martinis are all about, and I think it's about time that I found out.
That's funny that a film could have that influence on you, and I'm totally with you, because I can't tell you how many times I've experienced other people getting drunk and kind of just a little too out of control. I'm like, that's really not for me. So I'm with you there. It also said Dr. No showcased the early days of Bond's career. Now, this is what's interesting about this film. This is the very first James Bond movie ever, Gar. And yet, it was actually based on the sixth book in the book series. That's what they based the movie off of. And you'd think in the very first movie they might kind of have like an origin story, kind of telling the story of how he became a spy, but they never actually really do. It's kind of that's kind of in the back story. They never actually tell the origin, but that's what's interesting. The very first movie is based on the sixth book in the series, but they were able to make it work. And you kind of, this is a very young James Bond.
Well, from what I understood is the reason why they chose Dr. No was because it simplified the filming production aspect of it.
Yeah.
Which reduced the cost and all of those different things like that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, because in all actuality, Dr. No was a low-budget movie. The studios did not sink a lot of money into that movie, and therefore, when it exploded in popularity, the studios just raked in all kinds of money. You know what I mean? Yeah. And you look at the numbers, and compare it by the numbers today, it's paltry. But back in the early 1960s, you could buy a brand new 3-bedroom house for $15,000.
Oh wow, yeah. And another thing, there wasn't a ton of them in this movie, but again, this is the first movie, and this is where it kind of got its start. Another thing Bond movies became famous for was his gadgets, his little pins that would explode and little things throughout the franchise.
Well, that really, that aspect of it really got my attention because here's the thing. I can't speak for women because I don't really see women show this kind of interest. And there's exceptions to all rules.
Sure.
But men seem to gravitate towards gadgets.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do with the popularity of technology nowadays. Because gadgets exist in all areas of technology. Brand new area for me, cameras.
Sure.
Because I'm very much starting my own video production setup, for cameras. But and it's so interesting. It's like cameras have become this really interesting gadget. And computers. People love computers. Like, there's so many different aspects. Even in the kitchen, there are gadgets with technology.
Yeah.
It exists in everywhere. So James Bond really kind of discovered on accident the public gravitating towards gadgets. Because when I was a kid and I was watching these movies, I absolutely was mesmerized by all of these different gadgets that he was using as a spy. And his car was an OMG moment for any young boy.
Yeah. And Gar, I didn't get to even thinking about this last night or until just now when we were talking about the gadgets. I think also James Bond, and talking about these gadgets, I mean, now every year, like in Las Vegas, they have like an electronics show where they put on display the latest gadgets that all these electronic companies have come up with, and I think that is very much influenced by James Bond.
Yes, for the same reason why people gravitate towards gadgets now is the same reason why people were gravitating towards James Bond movies and his gadgets, because they had never seen, and really the whole idea behind the gadgets that James Bond was using is, what'll they think of next?
Yeah, and again, this is something that just popped in my head as we're talking, but I dare say James Bond kind of even maybe influenced something like Inspector Gadget, in the sense that he had all his crazy gadgets, and Inspector Gadget's kind of like a nerdy version of James Bond. Maybe even a wannabe.
Absolutely. I think you're 100% right. I would be very surprised if Inspector Gadget wasn't influenced by James Bond.
And I dare say, if James Bond had not come before, I don't think you'd ever would have had either Get Smart or Mission Impossible.
And Get Smart was the perfect comedy take from James Bond because it took all those gadgets and made it so funny. Oh my gosh. The cone of silence, the shoe phone, oh my gosh, it just goes on and
it's
on
funny, Gar, because I don't.
And they just ran with it. It was so funny.
It's funny. I didn't even think about that till just now, and we're talking about all these gadgets, and Hollywood is famous for doing stuff like that. I mean, once one TV show or one movie has a great catchphrase, they all want to. Every movie being produced, the producer or writer wants to come up with their own little catchphrase. But then, in addition to that, James Bond also, they kind of set the mold. I mean, you can't see a James Bond movie without expecting to see some, great gadget. But that's almost something that James Bond became known for, these gadgets, and it's not something I think the filmmakers even set out to do. It just kind of was one of those things that organically happened, and they just ran with it.
Now, because of James Bond movies, if I had an Aston Martin, I would soil my pants.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I would love, just to drive that car and think, oh my gosh, if it just had this gadget or if it just had that gadget.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But to me, because I'm so embracing of the past that I would want it to be a stock Aston Martin.
Oh, that would be totally
just completely original, completely stock.
I'd be interested to know if they even still make those cars. I doubt it, but
who knows? Yeah. Who knows? But man, to own one would. Oh my gosh!
Yeah, and Gar, this is a perfect place.
Goosebumps. Yeah, goosebumps.
Perfect place to end this. But I also got thinking, just as we're talking here, getting ready to wrap this up, that I almost dare say that James Bond probably is also an inspiration for, Austin Powers, like a kind of, once again, goofy kind of take on James Bond, a comedy kind of spoof on James Bond, I would dare say.
Without James Bond, you don't have Get Smart, you don't have Austin Powers, you don't have Inspector Gadget. It influenced, our man Flint. That was another 60s cool guy spy movie.
Yeah.
Matt Helm with Dean Martin. Another 60s cool guy spy. You see what I'm saying? But without James Bond, you don't have any of that.
Yeah.
All of that springboarded off of James Bond. And I just touched the surface. There is a lot more that I didn't even mention.
In fact, Gar, we may mention in future episodes, because again, James Bond is one of those things. Like, there's 27 films. We could definitely do an episode on more than just one film. So I do see that down the line now. This will be going up next Saturday, so people can look for that. And when you and I get together 2 weeks from tomorrow, we're going to be talking about Bill Cosby, and it's going to be quite an interesting conversation. We will be talking specifically about his comedy special he had a number of years ago. I believe it was in the early 80s. I got to look that up to be exact, but it was called Himself. And we're also going to talk a little bit about his recent fall from grace to kind of bring it up to date. And I think that's going to make for a real fun, interesting conversation.
Well, when we were discussing it, I really was not in favor of it because what I think of him now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And his actions, have everything to do with that. But being fair.
Yeah.
Because I have to admit, he was so hilariously funny.
Yeah.
In his time period. But it was really hard for me to see doing an episode on him until you brought up, being fair.
Yeah.
Bringing up both, and we will discuss both. And that, to me, is fair.
And here's a final thing in the wrap-up for today. And the reason I initially had the idea to do an episode on this comedy special himself was I was reading somewhere where Jerry Seinfeld was saying, like, how Bill Cosby influenced his career, and specifically this comedy special himself, which I'd never heard of. So I'm like, well, I got to go see if they even have it on YouTube and check it out. And I was cracking up laughing. I'm like, I got to get the DVD to kind of really be able to see the whole thing. And I did. And so that's another reason we do these episodes, because there are great films like this. Like, I might not have seen Dr. No myself, Gar, had it not been for doing this show. And I like to know what I'm talking about. So I'm like, well, I haven't seen that. I would like to see, for a fact, it's the original James Bond movie. If we're going to talk about it, I like to, be able to know what I'm talking about. So I did watch the film last night, so, it's fresh in my head.
Well, you can't watch a movie like that without getting nostalgic.
Yeah.
And that is part of the experience of re-experiencing these things from the past, is that warm feeling of memories of going back to when we were young and we were experiencing this for the first time. And that is what makes us different from someone that is much younger, that doesn't have that background of affinity.
Yeah.
So when they watch it, they just kind of see it as old, and old technology and things. The personal preferences are different now.
Oh, sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But for me, it's and I get the same thing from doing the time machine.
Yeah.
It's a warm feeling of going back to when both you and I, Jason, were younger and were experiencing this for the first time.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it special.
Yeah, and I know we turn a lot of people on, who will, like, listen to our show, and then they will go check out what we were talking about. They will go sort that out. Like, they will go see if they can find the movie on YouTube or a classic TV show we were talking about,
Well, if anyone can experience the same warm feeling and all that I am, if I'm bringing that to other people, oh my gosh!
Hey, Gar,
I cannot express how humble that would make me feel.
Hey, Gar, in reference to one of our recent episodes and one of our favorite classic TV shows, to wrap this up for today, in a word, A. Of course, that's the Fonz, which I'm not, but we like to pretend that we are sometimes.
He's just another cool guy.
Yeah. Okay, Gar, another great episode. Thanks, my friend. Bye-bye.
All good, brother.